Goldman Sachs is bracing for potential losses of as much as $1.2 billion in its consumer business.
Tesla lays off hundreds of autopilot workers in its latest staffing cut.
Trump inner circle January 6th, guns to the Capitol, threats of Mike Pence ignored, and Secret Service keeping Trump from going there himself. Beijing and Hong Kong ease some travel quarantines. I'm Ed Baxter with Global News.
Iga Swiatek continues to roll while Serena Williams loses in the first round at Wimbledon. I'm Dan Schwartzman. I'll have that story and more coming up in Bloomberg Sports.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, on Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Daybreak Asia, the Wednesday edition. It is now 8 in the morning in Tokyo. We're an hour away from trading in Japanese equities. Also an hour away from market action in both Seoul and Sydney. If you're joining from the region, good morning. I'm Doug Krisner at the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York.
A very good morning to everyone. I'm David Inglis. I'm joining out of Hong Kong. It's just gone past 7 a.m. here, so we're just about 2.5 hours away also from the cash market open here in the city, not from the Chinese mainland. You are listening to Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, and we are presented by IBKR Investment Advisors. Switch to Interactive Brokers for lower cost or lowest cost global trading and turnkey custody solutions. No ticket charges and no conflict of interest at ibkr.com/RIA. Right, so as we get underway this Wednesday for the Wednesday session here, so the bears are out to some extent, Brian Curtis, but the bulls seem to be still in bed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it still looks like what we saw last week was a bear market rally, sort of dead cat bounce. Back to the basic trend today, and a lot of that's driven by consumer confidence being lower, oil prices heading higher, and investors just feeling as though, the Fed is not your friend here. You don't want to fight the Fed, and the Fed is decidedly, aggressive here in raising interest rates, and so stick with the trend and sell some of these rallies. So we saw that U.S. consumer confidence down below 100 at 98.7, and expectations just 66.4, so quite downbeat there. We also had South Korean consumers turning pessimistic for the first time in more than a year. The composite consumer sentiment index down to 96.4 from 102.6 in May. Looking across the futures in Asia, mostly lower, but as I was saying, it's not that dramatic. China futures down 0.6%, and oftentimes we've actually rallied during the day in China, and no matter what the futures were saying. Hang Seng Index futures down more than 1%. Nikkei futures 26,810. That's a couple hundred points below the cash close yesterday. We had what looked like maybe an opening up because China yesterday reduced its quarantine times, but then Chinese officials came out and said this really has to do with the transmissibility and the length of time, the incubation period for Omicron, and it has nothing to do with reopening, so that may take us a little bit down. There's a lot more to talk about with markets, and we'll get to it again in 15 minutes. Doug, to you.
All right, Brian, thanks. Well, here in the States, some Fed officials were downplaying the risk of a recession in the U.S. We had the presidents of the New York Fed, John Williams, and of the San Francisco Fed, Mary Daly, both saying that higher rates are necessary as a way of cooling inflation, although, from Daly's perspective, a soft landing is still possible.
I think about when you're younger, you're riding your bicycle down a steep hill, and you can get too much momentum, and then you have two options. You can sharply put on the brakes, and you'll likely go over the handlebars, or you can tap on the brakes and slow to a speed that's more sustainable. And when I look out there in the economy, and with our policies that we're taking, and I would support, I see us tapping on the brakes to slow to a more sustainable pace, rather than slamming on the brakes, going over the handlebars, and having the proverbial recession.
That's a great metaphor from the head of the San Francisco Fed, Mary Daly. She was speaking in an online event hosted by LinkedIn. By the way, Daly went on to say that economic growth in the states will slip below 2%, but it won't actually pivot down into negative territory for a long period of time. By the way, tomorrow we're going to hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell. Testimony begins at 9 a.m. Wall Street time. He'll be actually addressing a panel. This is the ECB's annual policy forum in Sintra, Portugal. David?
Yeah, and I guess some great context there too, because we'll be having some of the inflation prints out of Europe ahead, of course, with the PC out of the U.S. So interesting conversations around inflation there. Let's have a look at Goldman Sachs here. So the bank could see losses from its consumer business accelerate to more than $1.2 billion this year. Now, we're told that the firm's internal projections show losses stem from new business lines, along with the effects of the pandemic and higher overall expenses. New accounting rules will also force Goldman to set aside more money as loan volumes continue to grow. Now, just keep in mind, Goldman is hoping its Main Street initiative will help find new income streams that's away from its core businesses of trading and investment banking. But for the moment, we're told Goldman is bracing for a 35% drop in its earnings. So,
let's check global news here. 6 minutes past the hour. The focus was the January 6th committee hearing today. It kind of gave us a glimpse of what the Trump inner circle was like leading up to and during the January 6th attempted Capitol insurrection. Ed Baxter with more in the Bloomberg newsroom in San Francisco. Eddie? Yeah, Doug, the witness Trump Chief of Staff aide Cassidy Hutchinson said the president wanted guns let into his rally.
Something to the effect of, take the effing knives away, they're not here to hurt me, let them in, let them people in. They can march to the Capitol after the rally's over. They can march from the list. Take the effing knives away. Then they can march to the Capitol.
And she says there were conversations that Trump actually wanted to go to the Capitol with the rioters inside and get inside, and that inside a Secret Service vehicle.
The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm. Said, sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol.
And also that Meadows was told that things were going to get violent and that there were calls for Vice President Mike Pence to be hung. A conversation between Trump attorney Pat Cipollone and Meadows.
I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the Vice President to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong.
And she says both Meadows and Rudy Giuliani asked for pardons. And during her closing, co-chair Liz Cheney said there was intimidation of witnesses to try to shut them up, quoting from an email from a member of Trump's inner circle.
Quote, a person let me know you have your deposition tomorrow. He wants me to let you know he's thinking about you. He knows you're loyal, and you're going to do the right thing when you go in for your deposition.
The committee will have further hearings in coming months. China has made the biggest COVID zero shift today. Travelers will now have to spend 7 days in quarantine facility and then monitor at homes for 3 days. The change still leaves China as an outlier in the globe that has tried to adjust to living with the virus. Beijing and Shanghai, by the way, say they've had no new locally transmitted COVID infections day to day for the first time since February. Hong Kong's incoming government is considering cutting the time inbound travelers must spend in hotel quarantine. It may go for 5 days, followed by 2 days of home isolation, expected to take effect after John Lee is sworn in on July 1st. Hong Kong police have now confirmed President Xi Jinping will attend events marking the 25th anniversary. And Ghislaine Maxwell has been ordered to spend 20 years in prison after a hearing at which victims described how their lives have been devastated by sexual abuse after and Jeffrey Epstein's hands. And Maxwell is 60. It's a 20-year sentence. In San Francisco, I like the new bells. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Douglas?
All right, Eddie, thank you. Let's get to our guest. Anna Hahn is with us. She's equity strategist at Wells Fargo Securities on the line from here in New York. Anna, thanks for being with us. I think the debate is whether or not we're going to have a recession here in the U.S. And if we do, what does it mean for the equity trade? What is your view on this?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. When we think about the recession or the probability, for us, a recession by mid-2023 is our base case. And what I mean by base case, it's more than a coin flip likely. But we think it's going to be pretty mild. Remember the definition of recession, 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction. And we're thinking the peak to trough to be about 1%. To put in context, the recession in 08 was around 4% contraction peak to trough.
So, Anna, David here. So I'm just looking at the SPX alongside those assumptions we're making on, at least you're making on the recession. We're trading at 17 times this year's earnings, 15 times next year's earnings. Do you think that's priced properly?
I think a lot of what's been priced in that 15 forward-looking is the tightening in monetary policy. And you bring up a great point, David, is that earnings and equities are very much about expectation, what we think is going to happen. So that contraction that we've seen also bakes in not just higher yields, not just tightening monetary policy, but also slowing earnings growth. I think the pace of that and whether it's properly priced really depends on the resiliency of corporate earnings growth this year and next year.
So it's not just the bottom line. Let's take a step back. Remember that we're in an intense inflationary environment, so net margin is going to be critical. And I think for the companies in the S&P right now, expectations or estimates for net margin, that's at a record high. I mean, something's got to give.
That's a good point, Doug. And for us, we actually expected net margins peaked in previous quarters. We were surprised to see in first quarter earnings of this year that large cap, especially the S&P 500 companies, had managed to sequentially grow margins. I think that is something that not particularly a trend that's sustainable, and particularly given the continued supply chain issues, even with China reopening, but also the higher wages that corporates are starting to pay. You know how wages can be sticky. I think these are kind of factors we have to consider going into the next quarters. And we're about to go into earnings season right now. I think you're going to hear from corporates that these inflationary pressures continue to nibble away, not just that bottom line, like you said, but also the net margin.
Well, you mentioned the China reopening there, Anna, and I'm wondering whether or not it's the time to get a little bit more exposure to China. We'll have more with Anna Han coming up. Anna's with Wells Fargo Securities, joining us here on DBA. This is Bloomberg.
How your business day begins often depends on what happens overnight. Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.
I'm Caroline Hepker.
I'm Stephen Carroll.
We get June inflation figures from Spain and Germany.
Lagarde, Bailey and Powell speak at the Sintra Central Bankers meeting.
And our guests include Emmanuel Cove from Barclays.
Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, coming up at 1 a.m. on Bloomberg 1130, the Bloomberg Business app, and BloombergRadio.com. Bloomberg, the world is listening.
Jewish Communal Fund board member and Jewish activist Martine Fleischman talks about why the JCF is so important for philanthropists, and especially when contributing to time-sensitive emergency relief.
I chose JCF for my charitable giving because it is a very, very easy way to support the things that I am passionate about. I suggest everyone choose JCF as a donor-advised fund. They are flexible, they are reliable, they get the money to where it's got to go quickly.
During times of crisis, you can count on JCF to get aid to your charities.
We have a special grants fund as part of our endowments that allow JCF to make a $500,000 contribution to the UJ Federation of New York Ukraine Emergency Relief Fund. And I feel very proud of being able to do something like that.
To open a JCF fund, visit jcfny.org or call 212-752-8277. That's 212-752-8277.
Chuck Daniels is a graduate of NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology. He's also a serial entrepreneur. Today, Chuck leads startup D3 Unified Communications based in NJIT's high-tech business incubator.
I have been one of the founding members of 7 new businesses. I think the way that NJIT is at the foundation of all of my successes is that it inspired me to look at technology, taking that as your toolbox, and then applying it to the challenges that come in the future. The disruptive technologies that constantly come out of the universities, coupled now with ongoing knowledge of the specific industry that you're working in, create these light bulb events of, wow, this technology can now help make this industry 10 or 20 times more productive, more efficient, more profit, more capability.
NJIT, New Jersey Institute of Technology. Learn more at njit.edu.
We don't just break news. We build perspective. Bloomberg publishes over 5,000 data-driven stories a day across multiple platforms, so you can gain insight and act with confidence. Ready to think bigger? Start at Bloomberg.com.
It's evening at the steakhouse, but Pete's reading his phone instead of the menu. Why? He's on BankofAmerica.com, learning how the economy is digesting higher food prices. Asia's go-to source for cutting-edge insights and trust. For insights so impressive, you can't stop getting smarter. Visit bankofamerica.com/smarter. What would you like the power to do? Bank of America N.A., member FDIC.
If you're having a business dispute, the process can be slow and drawn out, especially if you rely on litigation in the courts. You can wait for years before your case is resolved, and the longer your case proceeds, the more your case can cost. Not with the American Arbitration Association. Arbitration or mediation with the American Arbitration Association is faster. In fact, nearly 50% of our cases settle prior to hearings. ADR.org. Resolve faster.
Asian equity futures are pointing lower this morning with losses around 0.5 to 1 full percentage point. South Korean consumers also pessimistic, just like their U.S. counterparts. Details coming up.
Bloomberg traffic and weather at the inbound Lincoln Tunnel. There was an accident. This is coming in near Tunnelly Avenue. One lane is blocked, so that delay builds back at about 15 minutes. Outbound Lincoln, 20 minutes. Outbound Holland, 20. Into the city from the Holland Tunnel. It's 10 minutes into the Turnpike. 15 minutes in from 1 to 9. Inbound delays at the George Washington Bridge. 10 up, 10 down. That's late arriving Yankee traffic. You've got delays southbound Cross Bronx, 15 minutes into the bridge. Broken down car on the northbound Henry Hudson at 158th Street. That's why it's still slow in spots coming up from the mid-80s, and still some volume headed up the Harlem River Drive. 27 in Westchester eastbound, a slow ride in towards exit 11 in Rybrook. In sports, the Yankees host Oakland just getting underway. Mets hosting Houston just getting underway. Bloomberg 11:30 3-day weather. Tonight, clear, low near 65. Wednesday, sunny skies, highs around 85. Thursday, sunshine, high near 90. Friday, partly sunny, highs around 90. Right now in Central Park, skies are partly cloudy. We're at 78 degrees. New chef's chicken sandwiches from Panera. Pan-seared chicken, a secret garlic aioli recipe. Parmesan crisps and pickled chips, all in a buttery brioche roll. Try one for only a $1 delivery fee when you order on their app. Restrictions apply with the best ride. In and out of the city, I'm Ed Pileggi, Bloomberg 1130, bringing you global news 24 hours a day.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com.